For joining us today. The title of today's presentation is Hire for Talent, Leading Inclusion. The presenter is Sean McEwan, and he's the director at RealEyes Capacity Consultants. Just want to let you know that this session is being recorded, so you can rewatch it at your leisure. We'll pop it on our YouTube channel, and we'll also send it out via social media. We'd ask you, if you wouldn't mind at the moment, to mute your mics if you've not already done so. I suspect many of you have. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on Sean before we get started. So Sean's a workplace diversity and inclusion consultant and a director at RealEyes Capacity Consultants. RealEyes supports organizations to build cultural agility and workforce sustainability through diverse and inclusive workplaces that effectively leverage human capital and workplace culture. Sean engages with service providers and businesses across Canada to build their capacity in these areas. Sean's educational background is in youth services and mental health. Over the past 22 years, Sean has been designing and overseeing employment inclusion and enterprise entrepreneurship services for people with disabilities while providing leadership and coaching to teams of career practitioners while servicing job seekers and employers. Please welcome Sean this afternoon to the East Coast.
Good afternoon to you. Good morning to me. It's still 11 a.m. here. I hear that you all got some snow last night, the same as we did. Started my day shoveling snow, such is often the case in our country. I'm just going to move to sharing my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation, not to kill anyone by Zoom and PowerPoints, as many of you have probably already endured over the last many months. But there's a lot of good information on it that hopefully will allow people to read and absorb information while I chat away. As Christine said, feel free, if I say something you want clarification on or want to ask questions, feel free to just type it into the chat box, and we will pause intermittently through this presentation and just respond to those questions. So if I share my screen, I assume everyone is looking at leading inclusion slide?
Correct.
All right, fantastic. And I just need to make this a little bit smaller. Okay, so some of the basic objectives that we're going to cover today: just a deeper understanding of workplace diversity and inclusion, understanding sustainable workforce strategies, and identifying common ground. And of course, identifying strategies for effective collaboration to achieve diversity and inclusion goals. I was very happy to see we've got a couple of nonprofit organizations that I'm assuming are doing this type of work in this space, facilitating diversity and inclusion. So those would be good people for small business owners to connect with. And I'm not sure why, but I've lost all of my speaker notes. So I'm going to go back to the beginning here and see if I can find them again. I'm sorry, folks, but I'm going to pause a moment. I'm having some technical difficulties. So I'm just going to stop and restart the sharing of this screen. Here we go. Okay. Okay. So diversity and inclusion are related, but they're not the same. We'll talk about that. Given some of the upcoming workforce trends that Canada is facing, we'll be discussing strategies to develop and maintain a sustainable workforce, and we'll take some time to explore employment inclusion services and what those free publicly funded services look like, what kind of assets and benefits they bring to the table for employers. So we'll cover some of that. I want to talk about the fact that workplace inclusion of people with disabilities can help future-proof a business. And that might seem like a strange comment, but if we look at the value that people with disabilities as a diversity and inclusion group bring to the table, you'll see how this is something that, that makes sense as we progress through this presentation. So reasons why diversity and inclusion matter: sustainable workforce development, making sure that you've got workers in the future as our workforce ages, positive workplace culture and performance, attracting talent, and enhancing company brand. These are some extremely important reasons why diversity and inclusion matter. But in order to really improve our competencies in these areas, we have to actually take steps forward and look for ways to enlist some support to help us with workplace diversity and inclusion. And that's something that the service providers right across Canada can really help with. So sustainable workforce development, what am I talking about when I say that? Well, what I'm talking about is the fact that 60% of humans are living in countries with stagnant or shrinking workforces, meaning that their rate of retirement, the birth rate is not keeping up with rates of retirement. So essentially workforces are shrinking or staying the same. That's something that's happening right across the planet. In Canada, it's projected that over 25% of our workforce will be aging out over the next 15 years. That's going to leave a huge gap. We know that this change is coming and that we'll have to adapt. Responding to these coming demographic changes and developing sustainable workforce strategies are things that take time, and starting sooner rather than later will help. For the record, that adaptation will involve diversity, and the most successful employers will likely be the ones that started their journey earlier on. The reason why it will involve diversity is that immigration will be a huge factor here. So if we look quickly just at diversity and inclusion, the fact that 25% of our population is retiring and leaving a worker to retiree ratio of 4:1, you can see that's not sustainable for our CPP system. Our country's not going to let that happen. So what will happen is that there will be lots of immigration. As it stands right now, people with disabilities in Canada represent a really underrepresented group in the labor market. And this is not because people with disabilities can't work. When you hear the phrase barriers to employment, what I would like people to realize is that it's barriers to accessing employment, barriers to finding jobs, not barriers to working. That's something that's really important for us to realize. Workplace culture and performance. This is something that diversity and inclusion and people with disabilities can have a really positive impact on as well. Workplace culture is made up of collective values, beliefs, assumptions, and habits that form the rules for working together. And culture is essentially workplace behavior, the range of actions that are expected, delivered, or tolerated. And this culture is learned through interaction and shaped by people. So workplace culture is very, very much not just about our values and beliefs, but about our behaviors towards each other in the workplace. And a foundational element of good workplace culture is inclusion. Most workplaces are pretty busy doing the core purpose operational work that gives them profits, to give much time and attention to workplace culture. But as it turns out, giving some time and attention to workplace culture has a really big impact on how effectively that core purpose work is being achieved and how engaged and motivated people are at work. Workplace culture can help speed a business towards growth, innovation, and profit, or it can be a real ball and chain that holds a business back from reaching its potential. And unfortunately, not all companies, most companies, I would say, aren't spending much time and effort on this critical element of their brand and performance. I'm hoping that some of that is changing during the pandemic. I think as we become more conscious of the mental health and well-being of workers, we're maybe paying a little bit more attention to that, maybe some silver linings there. Employee engagement. This is a big element of workplace culture. Engaged employees are those who are involved in and enthusiastic about and committed to their work and workplace. That's a definition from Gallup. as it stands right now, that there's good news and bad news. The good news is that Canada and the United States have some of the most engaged workers on the planet. Unfortunately, those high rates of worker engagement are still at only 31%. That is not a super high rate of people that feel engaged and enthusiastic and committed about their work. And 69% of employees are not engaged or actively disengaged. If we could flip those numbers around, I wonder what would happen to Canada's GDP and to the profit margins of the businesses that are attending or watching this presentation. These are well-researched, measurable statistics on engagement of employees. A healthy workplace culture, one that understands inclusion and a strengths-based employment approach, has a really positive impact on engagement and productivity. I'm going to flip to a slide on so this is from the Gallup State of the Global Workplace report that was conducted, I want to say 2017. So not too old, fairly recent. This State of the Global Workplace report was conducted through employee engagement surveys in over 150 countries with a minimum of 1,000 people surveyed in each country. And this chart is based on that work and a meta-analysis of 339 research studies across 49 industries. This was a huge study. So in terms of employee engagement, what happens? Higher customer metrics, higher productivity, higher sales, higher profitability, lower absenteeism, lower turnover, less shrinkage or lost product, 70% fewer employee safety incidents. There's clearly a very positive impact to employee engagement and workplace culture. And again, I'm going to bring that back to a culture that's inclusive of everyone that works there is a foundational element of positive workplace culture and employee engagement. There's also, as we discussed earlier, attracting new talent. This is going to be a really significant challenge for employers going forward because it is going to become a job seekers market. All research and workforce demographic trends indicate that attracting and retaining talent will become a significant issue for business within a decade. So millennials and Gen Z, younger generations, will comprise over 70% of our workforce within 4 years. And these are groups that statistically care a lot more about diversity and inclusion and healthy workplace cultures. So those things really factor into the job choices of this generation. In turn, we also see growth in the gig economy. Again, I think the pandemic has probably just grown the gig economy between things like Uber and delivery and working online, gig work. That gig economy and a job seekers market will really mean that culture matters, and it will really mean that employers need to start figuring out strategies to become employers of choice in the future of work. I'm going to perseverate a little bit on this idea of core purpose work. That core purpose work, the one that uses up all of your time, and those core work activities that produce company outputs, goods and services, that's what most of us are spending all of our time on at work. And it's hard to get to strategy. It's hard to get to the sometimes complex work of improving workplace culture, but it's really critical to engage in that strategic work in order to make sure that we're getting the highest level of performance and engagement and the lowest amount of time going to things like staff turnover and staff performance issues. Real diversity and inclusion outcomes and workplace culture outcomes, those things take time, consideration, effort, even courage. And it's easy for our good ideas and goals to just remain in the realm of the theoretical if we don't take action towards them. This is something that collaboration and direct experiential learning can help you with. And we will talk about that soon, including the role that employment service providers can play in helping to enlist support and maybe outsource a little bit of some of this work. The employment inclusion service providers across Canada see an awful lot of workplace culture, and they have some pretty good ideas about workplace culture and inclusive cultures that they can help employers with. Let's talk a little bit just about a definition of diversity. Everybody's pretty familiar with that. The main reason that leveraging diversity brings benefit to a workplace is that diversity of thought and experience means people are bringing new and different perspectives and approaches to problem solving. That's a pretty important consideration when we think about the fact that as technology and culture and the global workplace expand and change, as that shifting, moving landscape occurs, there are new problems coming up all the time. And in fact, the future of work holds a plethora of problems that we haven't even thought of yet. When we're focusing on disability as diversity, what I would say is that this diversity group can have a profound impact on workplace diversity and inclusion when paired with service provider collaboration. And people with disabilities have been solving problems their whole lives that the rest of us haven't even had to think about. So there's strength in this fact. There's strength in that diversity of thought and experience. Inclusion, just to define that a little bit, because I think that's the part of this equation that people get stuck on. They think about diversity and inclusion as the same thing. It's very different. A definition I really like is diversity is about counting people and inclusion is about making people count. There's no point in bringing diverse groups through your doors and into your business if those people aren't going to be included and treated well. They're not going to offer what they have to offer if they aren't feeling included. And very importantly, inclusion benefits everyone. It's not something that just people who are part of a diversity group need. It's something that all of us need on a very, very basic fundamental level. And we will talk more about that as well. So a culture of inclusion, I would say, would be one where all employees are valued for their unique perspectives and talents and experiences, regardless of any demographic differences. And one where employees are provided with the tools and opportunities to contribute to their full potential. Inclusion is not a passive thing that happens based on leadership's value for inclusion. Inclusion happens when it's demonstrated through actions and behaviors towards each other. Inclusion is an element of workplace culture that benefits all employees by making them feel welcome, safe, and engaged. And people who are not included, this is a really important consideration. We'll talk about the flip side of inclusion right away. But people who are not feeling included and safe and welcome simply do not contribute as much and are more likely to leave. There are some pretty harsh costs to that for employers, both in terms of staff turnover, reputation, all of the nasty things that come along with an unhappy employer-employee relationship. So let's look at what happens when people are not included. What I'd like is for people to just read through this slide, read through these words, and as you read them and hear them, think about how those words make you feel if you're experiencing any response whatsoever. Exclusion, alone, outcast, unwelcome, don't matter, frozen out, uninvited, unheard, voiceless. How does an absence of inclusion affect people? Do we perform well under these circumstances when we're clearly not not on the inside, not included. So many employers have in groups and out groups, and it's so hard sometimes for people in leadership positions to even see that. Leaders are treated very differently in a workplace than colleagues and people on a lateral level necessarily are. When we are not included, do we perform well? Do we give our best? Do we stay? It's very important that inclusion be deeply embedded in workplace culture, because if it's not, our organizations, our companies are paying for its absence. Humans are absolutely wired for inclusion. This is why this stuff matters so much. This isn't really, it might sound a little callous, but I don't talk about this stuff because I think it's a nice thing to do. I talk about it because I really think it will help business performance. That happens to align with some of my personal views and some of the rest of my work, helping with diversity and inclusion, in particular, helping people with disabilities and Indigenous people get into the workforce. It aligns, but in truth, there's a serious business case for inclusion. Our brains have evolved over 4 to 7 million years to perceive social connections as essential to our survival. Humans survived as a species because we lived in groups, and we're very hardwired to perceive relatedness to others as safe and rewarding. And we're very hardwired to perceive exclusion as very unsafe and threatening. And I want you to think about how little it takes, how little it takes socially for a slight, a comment that is demeaning or maybe meant to be funny, but is devaluing somebody else in the room. Think about how easily that impacts you. We are very, very designed to notice whether we're included or not included. And when you're going to a job 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and there's constant little microaggressions is the word that people use for them, that kind of communicate, we don't think you're as good as us. That is not something that allows a person to feel safe and welcome, and for them to perform, and for them to offer their opinions and their points of view. So this is a really important thing to consider. What's really kind of astounding about inclusion and perceptions of inclusion is that even witnessing behavior that excludes our coworkers actually can cause us to lose trust and engagement in our workplace. So those exclusionary behaviors that we sometimes allow to happen in the workplace, those are affecting everyone who even witnesses them. They're not just affecting the people who are direct victims. There's fallout from that for the rest of the people in that environment. Inclusion is very much a universal need. And again, it shouldn't be something that's taken for granted from a leadership position. When you're in a position of either perceived or real power or authority, you're getting treated differently. You have different benefits. You're not necessarily seeing the barriers that other people are facing, and sometimes the exclusionary behavior, or even abusive behavior that other people are facing. So we need to find ways to kind of keep track of that. There's some excellent resources in Canada around psychological health and safety through an organization called Guarding Minds at Work. There are self-assessments that businesses can undergo and get good resources and assistance with simple little things you can do at work to make for a more inclusive workplace culture. When it comes to hiring people with disabilities, this is an interesting effect, and I want to spend some time talking about this, but hiring someone with a disability for the first time typically takes people in leadership and management positions out of our comfort zone and diverts our attention to actions and protocols and behaviors that more effectively include people and support their success. And what happens, ideally, over time is that attention and action towards including people start to become habit. This is why hiring and mentoring and accommodating an employee with a disability can really build a workplace's capacity to better hire, mentor, accommodate, and include all new employees. Disability is a type of diversity that can help teach inclusive behavior. I want to talk about the fact that there are a lot of diversity groups, and I think sometimes employers find it a bit overwhelming to think, do I have to do something different for every group that comes through the door? And I don't think that that's true. I think that what we need to consider doing more of is something called inclusive design. And this is about designing things, environments, and systems in ways that work for everyone. So usable by all people to the greatest extent. And inclusive design or universal design, it's a process. It's not a result. It's not something that you need to be academically trained up in. It's more of a concept and a process. So again, designing environments, things, and systems in ways that work for everyone. And how easy that is to do is to simply look at this bottom bullet point, asking the question, who would be excluded by this process, by this environment, by this system? When you're buying office furniture, when you're purchasing workstations, when you're looking at communication platforms, are there accessibility features built in? I don't know, I think it's about 10 years now, I've just stopped buying desks for new employees that aren't adjustable desks. And to be honest, sitting is the new smoking, right? So sometimes being able to stand up and sit down, that's something that benefits everyone, but it's absolutely something that would benefit a person who uses a wheelchair or somebody who has degenerative spinal arthritis and needs to change positions many times. So little things like that, just thinking what's most accessible, what's usable by everyone. Employment service providers have to do this kind of creative thinking all the time. When we're helping employers and new employees who have disabilities with onboarding, with training and retention processes, we're constantly looking at what is a way that accommodates this person, but actually makes this better for everyone, makes this workplace more accessible to any new employee. This is the kind of creative thinking that workplaces start to engage in when they employ a person with a disability. That's something we notice very frequently, that individuals in the workplace will know more about those processes, about the systems, about the tools than we as an employment service provider will use. And when they see that we're trying to accommodate a person and the reason that we're trying to accommodate them with something very simple, it catches on. Other coworkers start looking at, oh yeah, okay, I can see what they're struggling with there. I have a way of solving that. And as we're engaging folks in the workplace about making things work for everyone, for all of their colleagues, that entire workplace starts to become a little bit more inclusive, and people start to develop skills and habits that are inclusive. We get good at the things that we put into practice, not the things that we just think about. This is one of the reasons why this whole presentation exists. Hire for Talent put this together because they understand that business sustainability, that workforce sustainability is a coming issue. And what they've realized is that people with disabilities actually train workplaces how to do diversity and inclusion better. So hiring people with disabilities actually kind of hacks diversity and inclusion and allows employers to really build skills and build capacity faster, particularly when they're collaborating with a service provider to do it, because they get some free inclusion coaching, they get to outsource some of their problem solving, and they get some direct assistance with designing accommodations from people who are really familiar with doing that. So again, we get good at the things we put into practice, not just the things that we think about. That's why hiring somebody with a disability can put us in that position. This is an example of universal design or inclusive design. I know that this slide is meant to talk about equality versus equity. I just want us to look at the fencing. So you can see what is intended here. People are trying to accommodate people with different needs, but in the third slide, they've just designed it in a way that works well for everyone. everyone except the people trying to make money off the baseball game, I guess. So this is an example. Other examples might include automated door openers. I remember a few years ago getting automated door openers installed in our workplace. We were a large organization helping people with disabilities. And when I hired a gentleman who used a wheelchair and had mobility issues with his hands as well from a spinal cord injury, the first thing I realized is our workplace is nowhere near as accessible and accommodating as I thought it was. So we accessed some grants through Enabling Accessibility Canada. That's a fund that any employer can access actually to help make their workplace more accessible. So as soon as all of these automated door openers were installed, the first thing I noticed is people carrying 2 cups of coffee or, carrying a box of files. They would start hip checking the door openers. And I realized, oh, this is a universal design issue. Everyone uses the automatic door openers. Wheelchair ramps in a busy shopping mall. You'll see more parents pushing strollers on a wheelchair ramp than you'll actually see wheelchairs on a wheelchair ramp. Siri recording a Zoom meeting or using the automatic transcription feature to create meeting notes. These are all examples of inclusive design. They're built in to the process, the product, the system to allow the greatest amount of accessibility for everyone. And those things can be put into play not just for physical things, but also for systems, for things that we do at work. So examples, employment accessibility. This is one of the big issues that people with disabilities face, not again, barriers to working, but rather barriers to accessing employment, to even applying for jobs sometimes. So what are things that employers can do to make their recruitment process a little bit more accessible? Application accommodations, interview accommodations, employee orientation, using mentorship, using social learning. Those are things that improve for everyone. It is universal design, inclusive design. Workplace culture. A positive workplace culture is really good for anyone with learning issues, with mental health issues, psychological health and safety, just really inclusive culture. Cultural agility for leaders and supervisors, managers, for people in those positions to understand that different demographic groups, different diversity groups might have faced different barriers than you do. They might not see things the exact same way. They might be experiencing things that you consider innocuous. They might be experiencing them as somewhat troublesome. And the ability to understand that just because that's a barrier that doesn't affect you personally doesn't mean it's not very real for that person. That's a really critical leadership skill. For me to realize that women are typically interrupted when they're speaking far more than men are in a meeting, and for me to make space for all of the voices at the table to be heard, that's a critical skill for me as a leader, and for any employer, supervisor, manager, to understand people are experiencing the world a little bit differently depending on their backgrounds and their experience. Emotional intelligence, awareness of yourself and your bias, awareness of micro inequities. When you bring somebody in for an interview and they're maybe from a different culture, and you notice that of your 2 colleagues and yourself doing the interview, one of you isn't even looking up. You're taking notes instead of standing up, shaking hands, making eye contact. That might not be something that would trouble us, but it might trouble somebody in an interview scenario where they're already feeling a little bit off balance and somebody's not even acknowledging their presence. So little micro inequities, things like that. Clear leadership and expectations. A lot of employers, I've been guilty of this myself, the whole sink or swim approach. Talk to your colleagues if you need to learn how to do this job. you know, giving people clear leadership and expectations, training plans, things like that. They're going to help people fit in a lot better and build their confidence better. And again, those are things that service providers can help employers become familiar with. I think it's really important to look at, how do people learn at work? How do people thrive at work? How do they not thrive at work? That's something service providers have had to do with every single person they've helped get a job. And they've had so much window into different workplace cultures. It's something that they've gotten really good at. And so one of the things that we know as service providers is that the single biggest factor in employment retention is how well you onboard and train that person. So if we're not figuring out ways to bring new employees on in a way that builds their confidence, empowers them to learn the job, connects them with mentors and social connections and social learning in the work environment, if we're not doing those things, our chances of losing that person and having to start that whole process over again are really high. So with regard to these inclusive design elements, very often engaging in simple best practices around recruitment, training, supervision, and communication fully meets the criteria for inclusive design. Let's talk about a framework for diversity and inclusion success. So these three things: growth mindset, intentional workplace culture, collaborative and experiential learning. These things represent an excellent starting place for building diversity and inclusion success at work. Growth mindset, very simply, the belief that you and your colleagues or employees are capable of acquiring and applying new knowledge. We've already talked about what's going to happen to the Canadian workforce. We already know that we're going to be replacing workers that we lose over the next 10 to 15 years with new Canadians, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, and people from generations that care more statistically about diversity and inclusion. Does that mean some change is required? Probably. Do you and the people that you work with believe that you and your colleagues are capable of acquiring and applying new knowledge to adapt to those changes, to meet those challenges and succeed? A fixed mindset is the belief that you already know everything you need to know in order to succeed, and maybe along with a bit of resistance to acquiring and applying new knowledge. There might be places in life where that's helpful. When it comes to workplace culture, probably not. This growth mindset is really critical to culture change. I think it's also worth knowing mindset happens along a spectrum. This isn't an either or. So this would change depending on the context people are in, and nobody's 100% growth mindset or 100% fixed mindset. It's just a simple way of describing an issue. The question, I guess, I would want to know in terms of achieving diversity and inclusion success, the question I would want people to explore in a workplace is, do you believe in the value of diversity and inclusion? Do you understand the why diversity and inclusion matters? Is that something your business feels that you need to improve? And do you understand that there are some things that you don't currently know but need to learn? Where do you fall along that spectrum? Intentional workplace culture. So this is about assessing your current workplace culture for strengths and weaknesses. And the best way to do that is by talking to people, by having very candid conversations with people, by being vulnerable enough as a leader to hear things that might not always be pleasant, and then to respond to some of those issues. Leadership really has to be the culture champion. Nobody is going to go far out on a limb in changing a workplace culture if they believe they're going to be penalized for it or punished for it. Another consideration is what gets measured gets done, what's rewarded gets repeated. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing. Sometimes nasty comments that get made to people at work, some people laugh at them. That is a reward. Those nasty comments will then get repeated. That becomes part of a workplace culture that, you know, some people laughing is more important than everybody feeling included. That, I think, would be one of the more common things that we see in terms of workplace culture issues with people. Establishing team norms, so talking about these things with the people that you work with. These are important things for us. You know, if people are feeling excluded or made fun of, not in the loop, they're not going to perform, and that's a liability for our business. We all need to be on the same page about doing things that are good for this business. And if we're doing things that are not good for this business, there will be consequences. You know, that's not something that's going to be tolerated. Making a workplace culture that's based on inclusive behavior rather than behavior that is the opposite of that, I think is a good place to start and important. I think as well, I talked about learning at work. Learning at work kind of happens in two ways. And one way is through work routines, and the other way is through social learning. So facilitating some kind of mentorship, facilitating a training plan that capitalizes on what are the work routines that this person needs to learn, what, if any, accommodation do they need with each of those routines, and then the social learning. You know, I've seen so many times over the years, an employer hire somebody with a disability, and they want the organization supporting that person to essentially supervise them. We are the least qualified people to supervise an employee because we don't work there. We don't know the workplace culture. We don't know how you get the work done. So assigning mentors and then having that mentor partner a little bit with a service provider who can talk about, these are the things that this person is great at. These are the things that they'll struggle with. Let's collaborate to make sure that we're getting the most out of their performance. Those are easy collaborative solutions. So to talk more about collaboration, collaborating activates more of your brain for problem solving. It increases your resources, ideas, and perspectives. And it actually makes you feel good. We know from neuroscience that effective collaboration releases oxytocin and dopamine, the same happy chemicals that dancing or hugging your mom give you. So these happy chemicals, this collaborating and problem solving, actually increase our commitment and engagement at work. This is one of the reasons why hiring somebody with a disability, collaborating with a service provider partner facilitates that collaborative and experiential learning, but it also makes for a better workplace culture, because as people participate in the problem solving and the accommodation development that happens, people become more committed to the workplace. And it is truly weird how often over the last 22 years, I have heard an employer who was initially reticent to hire a person with disability phone us or talk to us via email or directly, essentially conveying, hiring this person made this a better place to work. The number of times that I have heard that other service providers I've talked to, if we were in person right now and there were service providers in the room, you would see hands going up. If I ask the question, how many service providers hear this routinely from employers? This made this a better place to work. He made me a better supervisor, made me a better communicator. Our onboarding process and training process is better now because of this. This intentional formal collaboration of service providers and employers just holds enormous potential for diversity and inclusion results, and has been generally overlooked thus far. This is not something that we routinely talk about as service providers, that this work actually makes you a better employer, but it is a very standard result. And I'm happy to see that some of this information is starting to get captured in research and studies. So some more impact of disability on workplace culture. An inclusive culture is attractive to other talent pools, so other diversity groups that you might want to be engaging. Really, we want the best talent, right? As employers, we want the most talented people, the most committed people, passionate, enthusiastic about the work. We want the engagement to be really high because we know that that is what will increase performance. Motivated, engaged employees. Lower staff turnover, enhanced brand. Excuse me. When we realize that disability is one of the fastest growing minority groups on the planet, and that approximately 1 in 5 Canadians identifies as having some type of disability, think about the amount of customers out there that are either members of that 1 in 5 or are married to, or father or son or daughter to. When you look at the group of people with disabilities and their friends and family, that's a massive, massive market. And to be reflecting that you are hiring people with disabilities is very appealing to that market. Increased productivity, profit, innovation, safety, improved cultural competencies. So this is the piece that I'm starting to see in research, is that insights that employers acquire through hiring people with disabilities, they can apply in other ways at work that strengthen their business. And this is from Institute for Corporate Productivity, I4CP. So their last survey done with a huge number of employers across the United States, and they were focused specifically on people with intellectual disabilities, which is something like 1 to 2% of the population. It's a small number in terms of total disability numbers. So the stat down here, noticeable increase in cultural competence across the organization as a result of disability inclusion education. So insights gained are applied across all differences, such as race, gender, ethnicity, age, etc. 43% of employers surveyed said, yeah, we absolutely experienced a noticeable increase in cultural competence. This is what I'm talking about when I say that hiring people with disabilities can future-proof your business. When we know we're going to lose 25% of our workforce over the next decade and a half, when we know that diversity and inclusion are going to matter to sustainability of our business, and we know that people with disabilities can help us develop those skills that we need, building our capacity for diversity and inclusion, yeah, I think it's a very clear line between hiring people with disabilities and sustainable workforce strategies. Again, this was from the Institute for Corporate Productivity. It's also worth noting some of these first two items that impact directly on profit and competitiveness to the business. So the fact that their inclusive culture is attractive to other talent pools and the addition of highly motivated employees. Those things are notable correlations to market performance. How are we doing for time? Do we have any questions in the chat box at all?
None yet.
Okay.
None yet.
Okay.
Does anybody have any questions? Would anybody like to unmute and ask a question to Sean? Okay.
Sorry, I've been yammering on for the better part of an hour. I'm sorry it's taken me this long to check in with people.
No, I've been checking and I haven't, but no, this is great information. So
okay, perfect. Sorry for all of the talking and slides. I hope that it's engaging enough. I sure prefer to do this stuff in a room full of people and to be able to travel to different cities and meet people in person. But this is just the way it's going to go this year. Service provider knowledge. So for the businesses in the room that maybe have or haven't worked with service providers before, right across Canada, federal government and provincial governments are funding service providers to help different demographic groups get into the workforce. And the places that we see this happen most is with Indigenous people, new Canadians, youth, and people with disabilities. These are all groups that are underrepresented in the labor market. And so that's why there's attention to helping them get into the labor market, because the barriers that they face are keeping them out. They need a little bit of a leg up to get into work, but they do not need anything substantial in terms of assistance to actually do the work. Doing the work is something that people with disabilities can accomplish quite easily. What service providers have been able to learn over the last 30 years of doing this type of work, workplace cultures that understand or don't understand inclusion, supervisory styles that work or don't, workplace accommodations, which are so simple. And I would like to just very quickly say that whatever your current uninitiated experience with workplace accommodations might conjure up for you, it's typically something as simple as this person needs a slightly reduced schedule because of their stamina, or they need for something to be numbered instead of color coded because they're colorblind. It's not that most workplace accommodations are simple little accommodations that people can figure out at virtually no cost. That has been my experience over 23 years of doing this type of work. It's very seldom that a workplace accommodation actually costs money. What are the other things service providers are seeing? Mentorship, what good mentorship looks like. Factors in employee engagement, in employment retention, onboarding, training methods, hiring or inclusion failure factors. Every service provider team has had a window into hundreds of workplace cultures, and we continue to have these direct interactions, observations, and insights on a weekly basis with employers. I think that service providers in Canada probably see more workplace culture than any other organization or entity I can think of. What are some of the things service providers are doing? Talent sourcing and matching. So the job seeker services, the ways that we are serving job seekers, helping them to identify their strengths, interests, and qualities that we can then help match to job choices, connecting them to occupational training, testing, skills development, identifying environments and accommodations that really help those job seekers shine, educating them about workplace culture or employer expectations, facilitating matched employer introductions and interviews. These are just some of the services that job seekers with disabilities receive from us. And you can see those would also be things that would serve an employer. When we're helping job seekers do those things, we're also helping an employer get an employee that is more suited to them. So this is where the talent sourcing and talent matching comes in when we're serving employers, and making sure that we're bringing employees or candidates to the table that we really know would be good candidates for those employers. Incidentally, statistics say that employers experience hiring failure about 46% of the time in their recruitment endeavors. So 46% of the time, employers are encountering poor fit, poor performance, the employee leaving or being terminated. Service providers have a way better track record of that, because we're typically spending weeks, if not months, helping that person really sort through career exploration and developing job targets that really capitalize on their strengths and abilities. So for what it's worth, you might see that you have greater hiring success working with a service provider. What are the other things? Designing accommodations, helping with performance improvement plans, diversity and inclusion resources and coaching, and improved workplace culture through that disability inclusion and the habits and behaviors that happen through that. This is the other piece that I think is incredibly important for employers to understand. Any employer that might be suspicious of a service provider, thinking, oh, you know, they have an agenda. Actually, weirdly enough, and we don't talk about this in the service provider sector nearly enough, but we have the exact same goals that employer does. If the team of people that I supervise to help people with disabilities get in the workforce, if they are facilitating great talent matches for job seekers that are really invested in that job, they then demonstrate great work performance, engagement, social inclusion, they fit in at work, they've got a valued role, they're independent at work, and they're staying in that job retention. I view that as success, and I would worry about any employees of mine as a service provider that weren't facilitating those things. Those are exactly the same things employers are looking for. So leveraging service provider and employer experience, as well as workplace culture resources and tools, this is a slight pivot that really gives intention to the work of service providers. And facilitation of these common goals fills a really important need for workplaces while enhancing conditions for inclusion. How can we work more collaboratively between the service provider sector and the business sector? How can we work more collaboratively to achieve these goals that we both share? That is the question that's before us. So just briefly, Hire for Talent offers a great many resources. And Hire for Talent is not a service provider. They contract me to do these presentations because they know that I've worked in the service provider sector for a really long time. Hire for Talent is not a service provider. They are a Canadian Business Development Corporation. They are there to help businesses thrive. And if you go to the Hire for Talent website, which I've put in the chat box, it's just hirefortalent.ca. You'll see an enormous amount of resources for employers and even for service providers that are helping to facilitate employment inclusion of people with disabilities. So there's great resources there for employers. There's a new set of resources about how to leverage diversity and inclusion during COVID. But essentially, these workshops are designed to bring employers and service providers together. And I know there are a couple of service providers at this table. I'm not sure how many businesses there are. But what I would suggest is that if employers and service providers can begin having a collaborative conversation, looking at what do employers really want and need from service providers, what are service providers able to help with, what workplace inclusion questions do we have for each other, and how can we advise and support each other for greater outcomes? And what am I not talking about here that needs to be talked about? I think those collaborative conversations between employers and service providers can really, really help with development of sustainable workforce strategies, improving workplace culture, and making your business a higher performing business. So these questions would form the basis for some pretty good discussions. And I would simply ask the participants as part of this workshop, connect with each other. You have the opportunity to collaborate to make for a much more sustainable workforce over time and to build workplace culture. And that, I believe, is the final slide of this presentation. It is. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I can see there is a question here.
Yeah. So the question is what do you think is the best ways for leaders to reinforce culture and employee inclusion during this pandemic, especially if they have new employees or most employees who are working from home?
It's a really good question. I think one of the things that you often need to do as a leader is to help make space for people to talk and to express that you value that person. If the people that you supervise are seeing you want to hear what that person has to say, you're asking them if they're not volunteering it, and you're valuing what they have to say. I think little things like that can be really important. And that's something that you can do in a Zoom call. If there's something about the person, if they need some kind of accommodation. And workplace accommodation can happen on many different grounds. It can happen as a result of disability, can happen on a religious basis, you know, maybe the person has different holidays. There's lots of reasons workplace accommodation happens. To know that as a leader and to be able to represent it, to be an ally and a mentor to that person, and to show the other people in the workplace, I care about what this person has to say. I value them. I'm making sure that they have room to talk and that they're heard. Are you doing the same? I think that's something that's really, really simple. And it demonstrates it. It sets the tone. That's something that's difficult for leaders. Leaders are often some of the busiest people in a workplace. And, you know I forget it myself sometimes, but if you're in a leadership position, there's a lot more scrutiny directed at you than there is at anyone else in the workplace. People are really noticing how you treat people, how you talk to people, more than you would think. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. And you've given us lots of ideas and suggestions and things to ponder. So that's been great and very helpful. So thank you so much for today. Folks on the call, just as a reminder, next week, which is the 10th of February, Wednesday, we're having the State of the Province address, and this year it will be virtually due to the pandemic, and it kicks off at 2:30. So we'll be sending out a link to watch that through our e-blast along with social media. So if you're interested in watching it, you'll be able to do so. Sean, somebody is asking if you will send out and share your slides. So if you will, you can send it off to Wendy here at the chamber, and she will send them out to those in attendance today.
Okay, that sounds fantastic. Yeah, Hire for Talent is more than willing to share this content. And if there's a service provider at the table that wants to redo this presentation locally in person when you're able to, feel free to do that. Awesome.
Thanks again. And thanks everybody for joining us. We will hopefully see you all very soon. Take care.
Thanks so much.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.